The German Wehrmacht entered the Second World War with a deeply ingrained sense of martial superiority. This confidence extended even to the very clothing their soldiers wore into battle. Their standard-issue uniforms were designed for smartness, for a sense of military tradition, and often for moderate European climates. Field grey wool tunics and long greatcoats served their purpose for years of rapid, successful blitzkrieg. As the war wore on, and especially as American forces entered the European theater, a new kind of uniform appeared on the battlefield. This American gear, specifically the layered winter clothing, was often met with German derision. German field reports and soldier diaries contained mocking remarks about the puffy and clumsy American outfits. They scoffed at the bulky appearance of the GIS, comparing them unfavorably to their own lean, disciplined look. The German military culture prized a sleek, functional aesthetic, and the utilitarian American approach seemed cartoonish to them. They viewed the American winter uniform as an unnecessary over-engineering of the simple requirement of keeping a man warm. This hubris was a direct result of their early war success and a failure to adapt to the changing realities of mechanized winter warfare. The Wehrmacht had struggled immensely in the Russian winter, but the lessons learned there were often localized and not universally applied to the Western Front. The High Command mistakenly believed that a campaign in Western Europe would never subject their forces to such extreme, paralyzing cold. This fatal miscalculation was a symptom of the strategic overreach that would ultimately define the Battle of the Bulge. The German soldier was thus deployed in December 1944 under a dangerously false assumption of environmental conditions. The stage was set for a confrontation where the true enemy would not be the opposing army, but the savage indifference of nature itself. The German mockery of American pragmatism was soon to become a deadly self-indictment. The American army, by contrast, had learned hard lessons from its own early conflicts with cold weather. The chaos of the North African and Italian campaigns, coupled with initial supply deficiencies, spurred a major overhaul of soldier equipment. The result of this logistical and design effort was the M1943 uniform ensemble, a revolutionary concept in military clothing. It was not a single coat but a versatile system of layering designed to trap heat and allow maximum flexibility. The core of the system included a poplin field jacket and a button-in liner, which could be worn together or separately depending on the temperature. Crucially, the uniform included layered wool and cotton components for the torso and legs, a significant departure from single-layer designs. This layered approach was specifically intended to deal with the damp, chilling conditions of the European winter, not just dry, deep cold. The M1943 uniform's bulkiness was a direct consequence of its effective insulation, a necessary trade-off for survival. The design acknowledged the reality that a stationary soldier needed more insulation than one actively marching or fighting. It also focused heavily on protecting the extremities, with heavy boots, mittens, and specialized hoods being standardized. The American soldier, while perhaps looking less traditional, was significantly better prepared for sustained operations in sub-freezing weather. Despite its functionality, the M1943 was initially unpopular with many GIS who found it too heavy or cumbersome for quick movement. Many soldiers preferred the older, lighter uniforms until the first true cold snap made the necessity of the new gear painfully clear. The uniform represented a fundamental shift towards prioritizing soldier comfort and operational readiness over parade ground appearance. It was a pragmatic investment in the long-term fighting capacity of the American infantryman, a recognition that the elements were a constant battlefield factor. The American supply chain, though massive and complex, was capable of delivering these necessary, life-saving items to the front lines. This commitment to the soldiers' basic needs would prove to be a decisive, though often overlooked, advantage during the Battle of the Bulge. German soldiers, who often saw themselves as the professional elite of European warfare, held genuine disdain for the American uniform. They perceived the bulky, mixed-material M1943 as indicative of a soft, industrialized nation incapable of producing proper military attire. The term amateurs was frequently applied to the American forces, and their gear was often presented as evidence of this amateur status. German propaganda sometimes featured caricatures of GIS waddling in their oversized, marshmallow-like coats. They contrasted the American seemingly excessive insulation with the German soldiers' own tightly fitted, dignified wool greatcoats. Many veteran German troops had been issued heavier winter clothing for the Eastern Front, but this specialized gear was rare in the West. The vast majority of the German forces committed to the Ardennes offensive wore their standard field uniforms, which were tragically insufficient for sustained cold. These uniforms, while sharp-looking, were made of compressed wool which lost much of its insulating property when damp. The German soldiers relied on simple, often insufficient items like thin scarves and mittens, lacking the comprehensive layering of the American system. Their boots, though sturdy, were prone to cracking in deep freezes and often lacked the waterproofing and insulation of the American equivalent. The psychological component of this scorn was also important. They viewed their own ability to endure the cold as a mark of racial or military superiority. They believed their will alone would overcome the elements, a romanticized and dangerous notion that ignored biological reality. This intellectual arrogance led to a severe lack of preparation in the pre-offensive planning stages regarding cold weather casualties. Hitler's focus on surprise and speed overshadowed the basic, critical need for proper environmental protection for his troops. The Wehrmacht commanders failed to appreciate that in the face of extreme winter, a well-insulated man is a far more effective soldier than a shivering one. Their initial scorn was rooted in aesthetics and hubris, a blindness that the forthcoming weather would brutally punish. The German offensive, code-named Operation Watch on the Rhine, was launched on December 16, 1944. The surprise attack smashed through the thin American lines in the densely forested, quiet region of the Ardennes. The initial days of the battle favored the Germans, relying on speed and the element of shock to achieve their breakthrough. However, the rapid thrust immediately ran into severe logistical and environmental obstacles that began to slow the advance. The roads in the Ardennes were narrow and quickly became bottlenecks, exacerbated by the initial lack of snowfall but extreme cold. The early cold snap made the ground iron hard, but the damp air created a penetrating chill that seeped into bones. German vehicles and tanks quickly began to suffer mechanical failures, with lubricants thickening and engine blocks freezing. The German infantry, committed to the advance, found themselves marching for days through this brutal landscape in insufficient clothing. The cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was a constant, debilitating drain on their physical and mental reserves. The lack of proper cold weather gear meant every hour spent exposed was an hour closer to becoming a non-combat casualty. The plan was a desperate, high-risk gamble that required near-perfect conditions and flawless execution. The weather, which Hitler had hoped would ground the Allied air forces, soon became a double-edged sword. While the clouds initially helped conceal the attack, the ensuing brutal freeze became the German army's silent, most effective opponent. The troops' inadequate protection quickly turned the advance into a struggle for basic survival. Soldiers had to expend vital energy just to shiver and keep their core temperature stable, diverting focus from the military objective. The chilling reality of the Ardennes winter began to settle in, a grim counterpoint to the initial euphoria of the breakthrough. The true turning point in the climatic battle came with the arrival of a massive, paralyzing blizzard. Following the initial days of the offensive, heavy snow began to fall, accompanied by temperatures that plummeted far below freezing. The thick, powdery snowdrifts quickly became an insurmountable barrier for wheeled vehicles and even tracked armor. Visibility dropped to near zero, making coordinated attacks and effective reconnaissance nearly impossible. The snow did exactly what Hitler wanted by grounding Allied aircraft, but it simultaneously crippled his own advancing divisions. For the German infantry, the conditions transformed their insufficient uniforms from merely inadequate to actively life-threatening. The damp wool greatcoats they wore quickly absorbed moisture from the falling snow and the sweat of exertion. Once the wool became soaked, the freezing air turned the material into a heavy, icy sheath that offered little to no insulation. Hypothermia became a rapidly escalating enemy, striking down men who had survived years of intense combat. The lack of proper boots meant that German soldiers' feet were perpetually wet and freezing, paving the way for horrific cases of trench foot and frostbite. Digging in for defense became a monumental task, as the ground was frozen solid, and exposure while digging was a death sentence. The morale of the German troops, initially high with the prospect of a major victory, began to fracture under the unrelenting cold. They were literally freezing to death on the march, watching their comrades succumb to an invisible, icy foe. The blizzard solidified the already poor German logistics situation into a catastrophic failure. It was a relentless, natural siege against an army that had grossly underestimated the power of the season. Logistics were the true Achilles heel of the German offensive, and the extreme cold delivered the killing blow. The entire operation relied on a continuous, rapid flow of fuel, ammunition, and fresh supplies to the spearhead divisions. The combination of the frozen roads and mechanical failures made resupply an agonizingly slow and often impossible endeavor. Fuel lines in trucks and tanks froze, and the lack of proper antifreeze meant vehicles were abandoned on the side of the road in staggering numbers. German commanders faced the grim choice of either abandoning irreplaceable tanks or watching their crews freeze to death guarding immobile machines. Medical supplies, especially those needed to treat severe cold weather injuries, never reached the front lines in sufficient quantities. Food rations froze solid, often rendering them inedible or requiring precious fuel to thaw. The vast difference in the logistical capabilities of the two armies was starkly illuminated by the weather. The American supply system, though also challenged, had the redundancy and the mechanical fortitude to keep supplies moving, however slowly. For the Wehrmacht, every piece of lost or frozen equipment was an irreplaceable strategic failure. The German foot soldier was forced to survive on what he carried or what he could scavenge from the battlefield or captured positions. This desperate search for basic necessities further diverted their attention from the primary combat mission. The freezing temperatures transformed simple tasks like maintaining a rifle or preparing a meal into major, time-consuming struggles. The logistical freeze essentially created a clock counting down to the complete operational failure of the German advance. The irony was not lost on the surviving German veterans, who later recounted that they were defeated by the cold more than by the American army. The American M1943 uniform, once the object of German ridicule, now proved its tactical and life-saving superiority. Its layered design was the key, allowing GIS to regulate their body temperature far more effectively than their adversaries. The water-repellent poplin shell of the jacket protected the inner wool and cotton layers from the soaking snow. This ability to shed moisture was critical, as dry insulation retains its thermal properties, preventing the catastrophic onset of hypothermia. The separate, button-in liners created air pockets that trapped body heat, functioning as a highly efficient thermal barrier. American soldiers could add or remove layers depending on whether they were hunkered down in a foxhole or moving under fire. Furthermore, the American Quartermaster Corps had developed specialized foot and hand protection that was widely distributed. The heavy, rubberized shoe pack boots offered superior waterproofing and insulation, drastically reducing cases of trench foot. While not perfect, the American system was a deliberate, pragmatic response to the known threats of winter warfare. The design prioritized survival and operational endurance over traditional military aesthetics. This dedication to the individual soldier's well-being was a testament to the industrial capacity and resourcefulness of the United States. It allowed American troops to hold their positions, maintain their vigilance, and perform combat duties while their German counterparts struggled for basic warmth. The uniform became an unspoken but profound morale booster, a physical reassurance that the army was literally protecting them from the worst the environment could offer. The scoffed-at bulkiness was now the very thing keeping men alive and combat-ready in the deepest, coldest foxholes of the Ardennes. The M1943 system quietly achieved a victory that was just as decisive as any successful engagement. The human cost of the Wehrmacht's inadequate winter preparation was counted in devastating numbers of non-combat injuries. Trenchfoot and frostbite ravaged the thinly clad German ranks, emptying units faster than direct enemy fire. Trenchfoot is a painful, debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure of the feet to wet, cold, and unsanitary conditions. The lack of waterproof footwear and the inability to change socks frequently meant that thousands of German soldiers suffered this fate. Initially, the feet become numb and swollen, but in severe cases, the tissue dies, leading to gangrene and often necessitating amputation. Frostbite was equally common, affecting fingers, noses, and ears exposed to the extreme sub-zero temperatures. These injuries were not merely painful, they represented a complete and irreversible loss of fighting capability for the affected soldier. German field hospitals were quickly overwhelmed not by bullet wounds but by the sheer volume of severe cold weather casualties. The sight of a frozen, gangrenous limb became a common and demoralizing experience for the advancing German troops. American forces, while not immune, saw significantly lower rates of these crippling injuries due to their superior gear and better logistical support. The priority given to dry, warm socks and insulated boots proved to be a life-saving difference on a massive scale. The crippling injuries forced the German High Command to divert precious medical resources away from treating combat wounds. The cold effectively acted as an insidious, silent weapon of mass incapacitation against the German advance. The war of attrition became a war against the freezing elements, a fight the German soldier was hopelessly losing due to official neglect. While the American troops endured the same brutal weather, their protective gear allowed them to maintain a fighting edge. The ability to remain functional, to load a weapon, to dig a new position, or to sustain a long vigil was preserved by the M1943. In key defensive actions, like the famous stand at Bastogne, the winter gear was a force multiplier for the entrenched GIS. Troops could sit in foxholes for hours on end, relying on the layers to stave off the initial onslaught of the cold. The American standard issue was complemented by improvised measures, such as stuffing newspapers inside jackets for extra insulation. This combination of pragmatic supply and individual initiative kept the American defense resolute throughout the harshest conditions. American morale, despite the initial shock of the offensive, was buoyed by the fact that they were survivable. They could look across the battle lines and see the desperate state of their shivering, ragged German opponents. The cold that was crippling the German advance became a psychological advantage for the defending Americans. The ability to operate and shoot accurately in the freezing conditions was a direct function of having warm, functional hands and stable core temperatures. This allowed for a sustained and determined defense that eventually broke the momentum of the German panzer divisions. The American soldier's gear allowed him to focus on the threat of the enemy, not the threat of the environment. Their bundled appearance, once the subject of German jokes, now symbolized resilience and practical survivability. The M in 1943 was the unsung hero that enabled the American forces to weather the storm and turn the tide of the battle. As the German offensive stalled and the logistics collapsed, desperation for warmth became a driving force for the Wehrmacht troops. The need for basic survival overshadowed military discipline and the pursuit of strategic objectives. German soldiers began to scavenge relentlessly, stripping the bodies of fallen American soldiers for their superior winter clothing. A captured American overcoat or a pair of insulated boots became a prize more valuable than a captured rifle or a tank. Diaries and after-action reports detail instances where German soldiers were seen wearing mismatched American jackets and German trousers. They raided abandoned farmhouses and civilian homes, taking blankets, curtains, and any scrap of fabric that could offer insulation. The search for fuel to start a fire, even a small, smoky one, became a risky but mandatory daily ritual. These fires, often necessary to prevent immediate freezing, also betrayed their positions to American artillery spotters. The focus on scavenging for warmth led to a dangerous breakdown in unit cohesion and operational focus. Men were prioritizing individual survival over the needs of the greater military formation, a clear sign of deep morale decay. This desperation highlighted the catastrophic failure of the German supply system to protect its own men. The sight of a German soldier freezing in his own uniform while coveting the gear of his enemy was a powerful symbol of the turning tide. The mockery of the puffy American clothing was replaced by a grim, desperate envy for its protective capability. The ultimate humiliation was not a defeat in battle, but the realization that the Americans were better equipped for the elements. The extreme cold and the ensuing logistical breakdown extracted a strategic cost from the Wehrmacht that far exceeded combat losses. Thousands of German soldiers were permanently incapacitated by cold weather injuries, creating a devastating drain on manpower reserves. The loss of mobility due to frozen vehicles and snow-choked roads severely hampered the maneuver element of the German plan. Tanks that ran out of fuel or froze solid were often destroyed by their crews to prevent capture or simply abandoned. This massive loss of armor was a strategic blow from which the Wehrmacht on the Western Front would never fully recover. The weather fundamentally negated the element of surprise and speed, allowing American forces to consolidate and counterattack. The time lost by German troops to treating frostbite or searching for fuel was time the Allies used to deploy reinforcements. The initial German advantage was literally melted away by the paralyzing effects of the winter environment. The German High Command's focus on the enemy led them to neglect the environment, a failure that proved terminal for the operation. The cold turned the Ardennes into a defensive barrier for the Americans rather than a launch pad for the Germans. It was a stark demonstration that in modern warfare, the basic protection of the soldier's health is a crucial strategic asset. The Battle of the Bulge became a definitive example of how logistics and material can decide the outcome of a major offensive. The Battle of the Bulge stands as a powerful and grim testament to the importance of military logistics and uniform technology. The initial German arrogance toward the American M1943 uniform was proven tragically wrong by the unforgiving cold of the Ardennes. The war's legacy in military gear design was immediately and profoundly influenced by this confrontation with extreme winter. Post-war military analysts studied the casualty rates and non-combat losses to understand the true impact of the cold. The American layering system became a foundational blueprint for subsequent cold-weather military clothing across the globe. Modern tactical gear for many armies still adheres to the principle of multiple, interchangeable insulating layers. The lesson learned was that a soldier must be equipped to fight the environment before they can effectively fight the enemy. The Wehrmacht experience served as a permanent cautionary tale about the perils of prioritizing aesthetics over utility. The frozen fields of the Ardennes memorialized the thousands of soldiers who succumbed to the insidious enemy of hypothermia and frostbite. The cold was the great equalizer, exposing the structural and logistical weaknesses in the German war machine. The M1943 uniform, often overlooked in the grand narrative of the war, was a silent, indispensable weapon of defense. It guaranteed the operational readiness of the American fighting man when his enemy was literally freezing solid.